slide?
We're good.
Okay, thanks so much. This is a lot of fun, and it's great to see so many people. This is like the good old days, and there are lots of people here who remember the good old days. So, as Boris said, I've been working on tools for thinking and writing for an appalling length of time. And today I'd like to revisit some early systems and old ideas and discuss ways that they influence or ought to influence our current work. Now, I'll sometimes do this in reference to my own work in Tinderbox, partly because I know what my influences are, and I have to guess what other people's influences were. Unusually, Tinderbox is a tool for thought that runs on the desktop and not in the browser. I think, nevertheless, it's worth a look. One reason it runs on the desktop is it's old. It started in 2001. But another reason is I'm really interested in doing things that require a lot of processing power. And you just get more processing power when you can get closer to the metal. Here's a bit of Tinderbox from a talk I did last month on the digital humanities. So Tinderbox has an infinite canvas, actually a hierarchy of nested infinite canvases, and also a powerful outliner, a hyperbolic view, and a whole bunch of other tools. We'll see a little bit more of Tinderbox in the rest of the talk, but not too much. Most of the work I'll discuss can be found online in the proceedings of the ACM Hypertext Conference and other allied ACM publications. The ACM is the Association for Computing Machinery. It goes back a long ways, and it is, for most people here, your professional organization. This literature is a really remarkable resource. It's free if you have the right affiliation, which many of you do, or membership costs something like $100 a year. It's very worthwhile. Now, I consider links to be the core of modern tools for thought. This is controversial, but I'm not really going to discuss a lot of this today. This is too deep, and if I defend this premise, I'm going to talk about links and not about history. I want to emphasize, though, that links need not be literal, and they need not be blue and underlined. Consider the magic numbers of Lumen, Zadelcast, and card boxes, or for that matter, Library of Congress numbers and Dewey Decimal numbers. Links come in all sorts of shapes, but links as a concept are essential. Now, hypertext is just writing with links. And it, of course, is deeply tied in our minds now to the World Wide Web, the internet, the information revolution. But it's worth remembering that the roots of hypertext lie in profound ideas that originated in the late 19th and early 20th century. And these, in turn, originated from the experience of the war that ran when I started this work. It ran from 1914 to something like 1953, and all that may have changed in February of 2022. This isn't just technology and hype chasing customers and dollars. It's a profound change in our view of knowledge, in the emptiness of our sky, and the importance of individual human choice. You'll see throughout I've added some additional reading, homework in the margins. I'll find a way to make this public in a more convenient form. Now, the three roots I identify are structuralism, existentialism, and the rejection of communitarianism. And all of these I'm broadening and extending and simplifying. Structuralism, broadly considered, is just the intuition that lots of things have structure in the way that lots of, for example, chemical elements turned out to have a structure amongst each other. So, I mean, not just the anthropological movement associated with Levi-Strauss, but things like Spengler and Toynbee in history, Vladimir Propp in narrative, Albers and Picabia and Elizitsky in painting, Schoenberg and Scriabin in music, all thought that there was an underlying formal structure which we were on the verge of identifying. Now, this manifests, of course, in Paul Oatlay's faceted classification system and his ambition to build a universal museum of knowledge, but also in the revived encyclopedia project of H.G. Wells' The World Brain, published in 1939, and later Mortimer Adler's Synopticon to the Great Books. You may know all of these indirectly through Asimov's Foundation, which is about the structuralist intuition as a code book for saving civilization, and we'll return to that theme. Then we have a generation of photomechanical tools for information retrieval, and the understanding that simple search is not enough. You do need intentional links. Vannevar Bush's Popular Science article, As We May Think, from 1945, is the best known from this movement. Less known is the fact that a Jewish executive at Zeiss Icon actually developed and built such a device and used it to run the company for several years until he was forced out by the Nazis. Existentialism, again, broadly considered, I mean the belief, especially growing out of the experience of the resistance, that you must make choices and that they ought to be free, and that you cannot always have all the information you need to make the choice, and yet you have to make the choice. Now, this, if you think about it, is the nature of the link, and it's also the nature of linking or otherwise organizing your notes. If you don't know exactly what you're doing, in which case you don't need notes, then you can't classify the note you're about to make before you've made it. In fact, you don't know enough to classify it afterwards. The rejection of communitarianism, again, broadly construed, also grew from the experience of war and post-war. You can't always get what you want, but if you try sometimes, you might get what you need, and what you need ought not to be subsumed in what everyone else wants from you. Again, your notes are yours, your data are yours, you can and should shape your reading to your needs. From the 60s on, Ted Nelson lobbied for the wholehearted embrace of links in a world of literary machines, a term that was once shocking and is now fairly familiar. This was a world in which you can and must understand computers now. This in the 70s was a ridiculous thing to say, but of course it's true. Nelson's view was hard to understand in detail, not least because Nelson, like many of the pioneers of hypertext, was not a gifted writer and certainly not a fluent writer. Yet the early books remain profound and complex. He grasped the importance of decentralization long before networks existed. So Computer Lib in particular is a serious, ambitious project that's a little bit hard to see under its very 60s, by which we of course mean the 70s, veneer of graphic design. It's worth noting that the aspiration of Computer Lib, though, has already failed. Far from hoping for a better world before we have to settle for any, today the hope for any world now seems absurdly optimistic. But we ought to take ourselves and our work seriously. It's not all just about getting a minimum viable product and then selling out to the venture capitalists. As Heinlein and others said, perhaps the horse might talk. Nelson is famously uncompromising. Nothing really matches the vision of how it should be, and he's very impatient with people who don't get it. As a result, much of the business press coverage of Nelson and his work has been very poor and outright hostile, because our business press equates insight with making a lot of money. Just look at the history of press coverage and popular science coverage of Steve Jobs over his career. So, also from quite early in the 1960s, we have Ivan Sutherland's Sketchpad, which was originally a doctoral dissertation, a pioneering effort in human computer interaction. There was a TV special about this amazing new tool introduced by the commentator saying, we're going to see a scientist talk to a computer. And he says, you don't mean he's going to talk with his voice. No, he's going to talk with a light pen. But more than this, Sketchpad was recognizably an object-oriented programming system. And it was written up in such a way that it was tremendously influential. People got object-oriented programming, in this case, almost 2 decades before there was object-oriented programming. He also pioneered constraint-based graphics, which really only took off at the turn of the last century. These are now staples when developing software. Now, notions of objects and inheritance, I find, are indispensable to knowledge representation, and knowledge representation is a bad term for note-taking. So directly from Sketchpad, we get things like prototype inheritance and tinderbox, or what Tana calls super tags. This is a very new technology. I can't believe that it took 20 years for inheritance to catch on in this domain, but it is also very old. Now, also from this era is Doug Engelbart's NLS, later known as Augment, a tool whose purpose was augmenting human intelligence. It started a lot of things: the outliner, the mouse, computer-supported collaborative work. It sought, in fact, over a course of decades, to bring about what we now call the singularity. And again, this is more than a decade, in some respects 2 decades, before that term was coined by Werner Vinge. Now, Doug was always a gracious, sensible, and engaged gentleman, not only with his colleagues and his fans, but with outsiders and people from fields he didn't follow. He was infinitely patient. His eagerness for the singularity was frankly disturbing to lots of people. And he was completely uninterested in why the singularity or the Superman equipped with powerful digital devices that were improving constantly might not be an entirely good thing for society. But NLS Augment collapsed in the late 80s when the last big PDP-10s, or VAX-20s, I forget which, were no longer economically viable. NLS was probably the last major hypertext system to actually die because its host went extinct. But it was the first to be revived, and it didn't take that long, by David Durand at Brown University. We worry a lot about preservation and standards and such, and what will happen if our tool goes away. But you can move, you can reparse, you can emulate. Today, we can still open Storyspace documents that were written in 1986 in a tool, in a Storyspace that shares no common code with the original. I remember when people were astonished that we were still using software that was 10 years old, but some systems go on forever. Emacs is another immortal system, a text editor whose extensibility allowed linking. So org mode, the most popular note-taking facility in Emacs, is certainly worth a look, and you can get it off the shelf today. Most important, Emacs is an extensible user interface. You could, for the first time, change its behavior in many dimensions to do what you want. This is the core to lots of modern extensible tools like Obsidian and Rome. It's a terrifically powerful idea. At the time, when you either used $$ commands in Tico or escape commands in VI, the idea of being able to take an editor and change its commands so you could use the commands you'd already recognized was revolutionary. Emacs might also mark the start of software as cult. The author of Emacs, Richard Stallman, is, of course, now a problematic figure. The combination of skill, fame, and money has led to some very doubtful behavior and some really disturbing politics in some corners of our world. Still, the early paper is really fine work. Now, just a little later than these systems, and by the way, this talk is far from chronological, it comes Storyspace, presented by J. David Bolter and Michael Joyce, co-authored by John B. Smith at the first hypertext conference in 1987. The screenshot here is a community college paper about Walt Whitman, turned in by a student in an English course at Jackson Community College. People, not computer scientists, not experts, not even gifted students, were writing interlinked essays for their term papers back in the 80s. One important idea in Storyspace was what Bolter called architectonic writing. You put a note, what he called a writing space, somewhere in the map, and then you write in it. If it's in the wrong place, you pick it up and you move it. If it says the wrong thing, you open it up and you put the right thing in it. Writing spaces have a title and contain a text, and they contain other writing spaces. Crucially, they stay where you put them, but you can always move them around. This avoids automatic graph layout, which turns out to be extremely hard, both in the computational and the rhetorical sense. It also works nicely because while it doesn't prevent maps from becoming deeply tangled, it does avoid much of the accidental knot work and premature formalization. Students especially find this congenial. They know that writing spaces have weight because they are so often beaten about the head with the shortcomings of their writing. Being able to treat writing as something physical helps a lot. Another fascinating system from this era is Trellis by Stotz and Furuta, not to be confused with the slightly later Trellix by Chatelain and I'm spacing. Trellis was a fascinating system for thinking about multimedia, hypertext as a Petri net. Now, as what if our hypertext is primarily videos and audios, but we might want to open a text window by clicking on a video at a particular time. In fact, we might want to open 3 different text windows at different parts of the screen, and all of them have links which may affect that video or may open another video. How do we deal with 2 videos playing at once, and so forth? All of these would open and close in response to mutual triggers, and it was all within an analytically tractable computational model. You could, in particular, figure out whether a particular trellis model would ever reach its end, or whether it would get caught in a loop or just get stuck after 2 minutes of a 30-minute expected presentation. This is a highly desirable property. So Trellis was both a system and a formal model. It was a fascinating system and also a series of papers with a hypertext as a tuple. It's an example of what a model can be. Too often standards are just a way for the dominant vendor to eliminate competition and freeze progress where we are. As an example of the sort of system that is unlikely to fit any standard of the early era, H. Van Dyke Perinack, University of Michigan, developed a system for exploring classification tasks. Here we have a bunch of things. We need to sort them into categories by using sets rather than links as the core primitive. Much of the best early work actually broke all the best early models. And much of this breakage leads to ideas of systems that would be really interested to work on now that we have more computational resources. Even though this has been neglected, and I don't think anyone since has used set theory as a tool for navigation, we do a lot of this with Tinderbox. Here in Tinderbox, for example, we have an agent, the lower of the two big boxes, which is a persistent query, and it looks for members inside the set of artifacts that are read. This constructs a new set with which other agents can use. Standards can easily stifle this sort of experimentation. That is often their purpose. The literature of these years is a veritable Cambrian explosion of interesting ideas, many of which I think are worth a fresh visit. Machines of this era, remember, had tiny screens. 500 by 342 was a really big, exciting, high-fidelity screen. Lots of people were still working with 80 by 24 character displays. And the CPUs, you only had one core throughout this era, and it had less processing power than you would now use to run your refrigerator. The ideas, therefore, are a lot better than the screenshots. You can't browse these papers by looking at the demos. Now, KMS was a really successful card metaphor system, one that pioneered large-scale technical documentation, actually deployed against on the USS Carl Vinson. Early systems with their screen space and their computational issues gave lots of thought to managing the screen, where today we just scroll and hope. Card metaphor was partly a concession to the limitations of the screen, but it can be a good idea. On an aircraft carrier, you do not want a really crucial piece of information to happen to fall below the fold and have someone perhaps not notice that this screen scrolls. KMS, with its card metaphor, leads to systems like Xerox PARC's note cards and the famous Apple HyperCard. A bunch of these systems, for whatever reason, often allow general computation to determine what a link did. This trades analytic tractability, which Trellis with its Petri nets and Storyspace, which uses finite state machines, for greater expressive power. Storyspace links, for example, in their classic version, could vary the behavior of your reading depending on what you'd already seen. This was absolutely terrific for hypertext narrative and remains really powerful compared to what we have in the web. However, Storyspace links are incapable of counting. You can ask if you've been there once, but it's quite hard to ask if you've been there twice. And it's impossible in the general case to ask if you've been there N times. So there is a trade-off, and it's real, but it's worth revisiting from time to time. Also from the very first hypertext conference is Intermedia, the last in a succession of tools from Brown University, and the tool that actually first escaped the lab and got used for actual work in actual classrooms in a networked environment. Sophisticated, subtle, expensive pedagogic hypertexts in which students not only read hypertext, but they contributed their work in the class to extending and improving the hypertext, not using the Wikipedia wiki model of everything everyone says is equally valid, but instead, students signed a publication release at the beginning of the semester, and their term papers and other work would be edited, linked in, and some of it still persists in the successor hypertext, the wonderful Victorian web. When Intermedia's funding collapsed, the Victorian web hypertext, originally known in the literature as Context 32, because it was reading for English 32, but it's now the Victorian web. It moved first to Storyspace and then to the web. The key here is intelligent editing, which prevents all the ghastly governance abuses of Wikipedia and the like. What Landau, writing about the experience of Intermedia, saw first was that while hypertext systems would turn out to be easy and fun to write, and many of us know that, the link itself was the most significant and tricky new punctuation since the medieval invention of the comma. And this is both true, but it's also worth reminding people that commas are technology, and for much of the history of writing, they hadn't been invented yet. Peter Brown wrote a system called Guide, which was concerned that hypertext links would confuse people in the way that go-to statements had confused a generation of programmers. So it focuses on stretch text. You click on a link, and instead of going someplace else and everything changes, the text alters right there in place, perhaps expands, perhaps is replaced by a translation, a refutation, a discussion. You don't navigate. Print stays itself, but electronic text replaces itself, and stretch text really replaces itself. People viewed this as an alternate paradigm, which they either liked or disliked for many years. There was a sense that stretch text wasn't quite as capable, especially in large hypertexts, as navigational hypertext, what I call calligraphic hypertext, the hypertext we know from the web, for example, where you click on a link and you go someplace. It took all the way to 2009 to establish exactly how this worked and how to make stretch text as capable as navigational hypertext, calligraphic hypertext. It turns out not to be hard. Also of note, Twine writers in the 21st century have revived interest in stretch text. Unfortunately, Twine writers generally do not publish in the academic literature or any place else that I've been able to find. On the other coast, Ben Schneiderman and many excellent students crafted hypertext systems for encyclopedias and museums and did careful studies of what users actually did with these tools. Their work remains outstanding, not least because they published results that were unexpected, and even results that they must have known were likely wrong, but data are data. For example, they had a wonderful experiment that showed with real users that selecting links with a mouse was decidedly inferior to having them use arrow keys. Now, we know this can't be right, but it was in fact a true result when it was new, and understanding that is a useful thing to keep in mind. One of Schneider, oh, by the way, Schneiderman has a wonderful email weekly update on AI and ethics, which you can easily find the subscription URL if you're interested in the cutting edge of AI and ethics. By all means, sign up. Schneiderman's student Randy Trigg, wrote a brilliant dissertation on using links to do hypertextual scientific reviewing. Then he wrote some brilliant papers on why link types don't actually work. To cut a long story short, it's because people cannot choose a single link type for what they're complaining about. It was great work. The link types probably do deserve a fresh look. There are lots of ways we could think about fixing link types, either multiple link types or making them first-class objects, or making them easier to transform or letting them transform themselves. We'll return to the idea of links and opening them up. But first, a British system, Microcosm, guy that was also British, by the way, like Intermedia, stored its links in an external file. This means you could have one set of links to a hypertext for the students and another for your colleagues. You could also use Microcosm to link into other apps, notably Word, which at that time had simply eaten the text market in the personal computer space. You could write adaptive hypertexts, which change themselves based on the user model. You could write links to all occurrences of a particular name. You could write links to all occurrences of a particular phrase or usage, except those in a particular section. So this was a very interesting way of writing links. This led, after an unconscionable length of time, to an interesting line of work that continues on sculptural hypertext. Now, we normally think of links as lines we add between notes. We have some notes or documents that we want to connect and hook up. But what if we started with a collection in which everything was linked to everything and took away, perhaps programmatically, the links that we don't want? Indeed, that's sort of what our modern tools for spaced repetition do. We give it a bunch of notes in a family, not all the notes, but only those in a family. We say, show us these in some arbitrary order or some order you prefer to show them. There were also, even in these early years, some collaborative hypertext systems. This was enormously difficult because not only were the machines programmed with stone knives and bearskins, but the networks weren't even standardized on TCP/IP, and so you literally were going down to bare metal to get two machines to talk to each other. You also had error rates off the charts. But Norbert Streitz and Jörg and Anna Hacke wrote these tools that are important in lots of ways. But one little detail I'd like to highlight is that they were the first to realize that curved splines for links had become computationally tractable. Lots of people assumed that curved links were desirable, but would have to be pre-rendered because we were used to computers. Not only did they not have floating point, you did multiplication by repeated addition in software. So the fact that curved splines for links were tractable was a huge surprise and immensely influential. Now, the very first and very important Xerox PARC hypertext system was called Note Cards by Randy Trigg and Frank Halaz and company. I'm not going to talk about that because I'm a little short of time, but this is Augment, its first replacement. Augment sought to make links first-class objects. And so links have all the attributes of notes. You can link to or from a link. You could say this link has one source and 3 destinations. It has a title, and it also has an explanatory note, and that explanatory note might also have links. This was described as a system to hold your ideas in place. Kathy Marshall presented it in the flagship paper with a slide entirely with slides entirely of rock star hair. It is an important formal system, which again, in the Xerox tradition, its authors exploded. Kathy Marshall was the great hypertext researcher of our era, and with Frank Shipman, she turned around and delivered a trumpet blast against formalism, and Augment is nothing if not a deeply formal system. They wrote a paper, Formality Considered Harmful, the experience merging themes and directions on the use of formal representations of interactive systems. Instead of formal systems, they proposed spatial hypertext, where instead of calligraphic links, you build clusters and aggregates in space. A spatial parser would look through the patterns of spatial relationships you had built and help you recognize and organize incipient structures. It worked sort of like a spell checker. For example, if you had 3 things that were lined up on their vertical edges, and you had a 4th that was only a few pixels off, it would say, did you mean this to line up? If you had consistently put a author next to a title, and you had a title with no author, it would say, don't you want to have an author here? Now, Tinderbox, in its original vision, was meant to be TinyViki. The tradition of tiny products was to take things from university laboratories, scale them way back so they would run on personal computers and that you could afford to build them. It really turned into Tiny Augment. It wasn't my idea, and I only realized it back later. And in many ways, it does honor the Wiki legacy. Spatial hypertext is a terrific idea, not least because it avoids premature commitment. Premature commitment is the enemy of all note-taking. You don't need to classify a note before it exists. You can get it in roughly the right place. If it turns out not to be the right place, you can sort it out later. It turns out that there is quite a lot to be said about the rhetoric of spatial hypertext. Again, at first, it seemed like this was going to be completely easy, that everyone understood 2-dimensional space and diagrams. But more recently, I've been interested. Well, a decade ago, I wrote a paper on sort of the grammar of vocabulary of spatial relationships. But more recently, I've been wondering about what our diagrams would look like if we followed, say, Antoni Gaudi, and instead of the typical note being a neatly trimmed quadrilateral, it was typically the shape of a piece of broken pottery, adjacent to other shapes of pieces of broken pottery, which fit together in an aesthetically nice way. Or perhaps the organic forms of someone like Louis Sullivan, with cotyledons sprouting into sprouts, flooding into florets. Shipman's later VKB, the Visual Knowledge Builder, extends Wiki. One of its fascinating features is it persisted its entire undo stack forever. So you could undo and redo or just rewind the entire history of a collaborative document. This was fascinating, both for personal notes and for things like the documents you use for planning work in a graduate student work. So you could have documents that were years old where you could go back and see exactly what they looked like 3 years ago and how you got from there to today. Of course, this is hard to write because you've got to be really, really clear about what's a semantic action, what isn't. But this is a very interesting idea. And in the old days, you couldn't afford the disk space to save all those action objects. But today, we have so much disk space that it's probably not economically viable to delete things. So that's a lot to cover and a bunch of systems and a bunch of additional reading. But I do want to say that there's a ton more. Polly Zellweger has some fascinating work on actual clinical studies of the effects of different animations for following links. Work that's both rigorous and tested on actual sophisticated users over an extended period of time, not just on novices who are eager to buy a product. There's a long tradition to which David Kolb and several other members of the audience have contributed on narrative narratology and hypertext. I'd also call out John McDade, of course. And I haven't really touched on this century at all. We are all before the beginning. And I'm isolated from most of my books, but you see in the right margin a list of a number of systems that I ought to have discussed, but didn't get around to. And this stuff continues. Now, admittedly, like all computer science, the papers now are a little bit harder to find and a little harder to read. Some of that's inevitable, some of that's our fault, and we should stop making them so hard. The social media part of the literature is less good than the hypertext part, but there are still ideas worth exploring. I still write weird new systems. I even finally won an Engelbart Prize this year with a young filmmaker, Steve McMorris. So it's good to know where you come from. It's good to know what you owe to old ideas for a lot of reasons. What didn't work then might work now, but it's good to know what didn't work then. It's also nice to acknowledge the hundreds of workers, not 2 or 3, who built all this, most of them very much alive, almost none of them very rich or famous. I've gone very quickly. There's lots to discuss and lots to worry about. I'll be here for questions, but my email is there. And if I don't write back to you in a day or two, ping me. I have a ferocious spam filter I'm trying to make less ferocious, but it's hard. Thank you so much.
So this is the tradition of clapping when we usually have a whole screen of video. You'll have to deal with just us, Jess and I, classing up on stage. And as you see, the chat is scrolling by, showing lots and lots of thank yous and appreciation for the talk. I'll speak for myself, but I think probably a lot of other people feel the same, where I have 8 windows open. I'm frantically searching things, and I'm like, I'm just going to sit. I'm going to grab the video later, and hopefully we can group transcribe all of our homework reading. Yeah, I mean, you only covered 40 years, Mark. We made it all the way to TCP/IP, and HTML1 or there 2, 3, thereabouts, right?
We didn't quite make it to HTML1, but
really, really great. Really, really fertile kind of stuff. And I'm really appreciative that we got this in at the beginning of 2023 so that we can revisit. We have a bunch of Q&A. And I think, Mark, for next time as well, I think, I'm like, okay, who's going to do the live transcription? Forget about pausing Mark as he's rolling along. So yeah, really, really fantastic. So I'll read out FGJK. You can see this as well, but we will get it recorded this way. My first contact with a real hypertext system was Bob Wallace's PC Browse DOS on a T1000 laptop. Are you familiar with that one?
I have dim memories. I think I kicked its tires. I don't recall that it was ever written up particularly well.
Awesome. I love that we have that captured as another node that we can link to. Gabo, in your opinion, what are the properties needed for hypertext to be an open hypertext system?
This is a funny historical term whose valence has changed a lot over time. The original idea, which comes from Amy Perlit's son, was that what we ought to do is have a system service that handles links, and you can and that this is part of the operating system, and so you could link into other apps and specific places in other apps. And so instead of the hypertext developer being expected to do both the viewer and the link model, you could just have links embedded in everyone's everyday work. This was a very fertile area of development and exploration in the late 90s. Microcosm was one of the big standard bearers for this movement. It turned out that the sort of scripting on which it relies was part of Embrace, Extend, and Extinguish, and so and was always kind of fragile. So in the end, it wasn't robust, and the web turned out to be a nicer model, especially in the modern world where we have programming languages that run with decent performance in the browser. But that's what open hypertext originally meant. Now open hypertext often means something like free as in beer, or it sometimes means having plugins.
Yeah, we the history of this community and talk series actually started with interchange, and if you haven't seen it, I'll drop it in the links. But Codex Editor is one of those things that started as an annotation system and then really realized that a whole windowing and in context linking would be really useful. So there's probably something in here about the web itself as an operating system that, tracks in here. We're going to flip over to Chris Aldrich. He's actually in the answered section. But Mark, I know you're aware of the commonplace book tradition, but I'm curious if you know any of the early computer scientists, especially any of the ones that you've named, who kept commonplaces. So either in a notebook, in an index card, or early proto-digital system forms.
Okay. Reading pointer, there's a wonderful book by Thomas Mellon, Mallon, on journals and commonplace books, a book of one's own. Also Bonnie Blair's Too Much to Know. So in the 18th century, especially, not only were books still very expensive and very rare, but in order to get access to a book, you had to go to the place or the person who had a copy. So you couldn't just borrow it unless you were on extremely intimate terms with the person who happened to have a copy. So you'd bring a notebook and you'd copy the best passages down. There are lots of writing from that period to today in praise of it. There's some cautionary writing, especially by Dr. Johnson, that this may not be the best way to approach learning. The guy to think about in terms of commonplace books is, of course, Ted Nelson. As I mentioned, Ted has never written fluently or easily. It's painful for him. But my goodness, he took notes all the time, 24/7. Back in the day when you went out drinking with Ted, he would take notes in the bar. There was a period where not only did he take notes, but he took videos and recorded everything. There are huge archives and warehouses of undigested notes from this period. But he was deeply interested in capturing ideas for later review.
Fantastic. Makes me think about Jerry's brain. I know Jerry is in the audience today.
Mikulski.
Yep. For those who haven't seen it, I had a lovely call with Jerry last week, earlier this week. How does time even work? And that might be another Tools for Thought project. I know that Jerry's brain is trapped in, and he would like to bring it out to something that is more interoperable. So fantastic. Where did Storyspace's maps come from? Any relation to Notecard's browser cards? Asks Mark Anderson.
Embarrassingly, I don't know. I knew about Notecard's browser cards in a vague sense at that time, but I'd never actually seen one before 1987. I don't know what Joyce and Bolter had seen. They were working at Yale originally on this project in the lab of Roger Schenck, of all people. So they had opportunities to see all sorts of things. I expect that it may be influence either from Fress or early intermediate, but I'm not sure.
Lane says, what work has addressed ergonomic concerns?
There was lots of early work on, like, our link's a bad idea because people will get lost in them, people will be disoriented by them, people will keep going back to the same place, people will get stuck, all of that. And there was lots of good work and quite a bit of bad work trying to prove that hypertext was either a complete waste or the ultimate panacea. That's not particularly helpful. There is a tradition of work that really goes back to Schneiderman, but is quite widespread. The young Jakob Nielsen did some good stuff like this, and his paper on the matters that matter is a meta study of early ergonomic work in hypertext reading that provides lots of leads to the very early literature.
It certainly feels like this is something that intertwingles with concerns of the operating system, the browser, the client, and different layers. I have had some discussions with folks who have told me that I can't do deep work on a mobile device. And I have responded that if that is the case, and since most of humanity only has a mobile device as their only computing device, then what even are we doing here? Have you given some thought to some of those things, and maybe calling back even to when will Tinderbox escape the desktop as perhaps another provocation for you?
Yeah, well, I certainly think about it. I personally am reluctant to go back to small screens. I mean, it is a constraint, and it's one that needs to be addressed because there are times when what you have is a small screen, and mobile is never going to have a big screen because by definition it's mobile. Now there are ways to get around it, but they haven't happened yet. And my personal advice is to let's get it right at all, and then we can fix it for mobile. I don't, in this case, I'm not sure mobile first is a desirable strategy. We're doing something that we barely can do at all, and doing it at all is probably more urgent than doing it on a particular tablet.
I think we should probably host a discussion on this whole thing, Jess, at some point. I will peek in because it's already happening in the chat. I am looking forward to seeing what happens with Apple's mystical device. Open and Apple doesn't often go together, but on the other hand, Apple is very focused on encryption and edge computing, which is perhaps a friendlier mode than folks that are not our friends who want to ingest everything centrally. Any thoughts on that? And maybe even like you're fairly embedded on Mac OS on the desktop, right, Mark?
Yeah, well, that at least for the moment, we were a Mac System 7 company. We originally were a fourth company back in the day. And then we were a Windows company, which still had a toe in the Mac. And then we became a Mac company again. I'm not really wedded to the Apple ecosphere. I am in the strange position of pursuing what would otherwise be academic research in an environment in which I'm funded not by the NSF, but by the generosity of lots of customers who find this stuff useful. And that means I have to be in a place where I can meet some of those customers.
Fascinating. And I would love to follow up. It's the kind of thing where I might buy Tinderbox to support you, but not use Tinderbox. And I wonder if an interesting signal would be something like Open Collective, where I could fund Mark Bernstein. So we've had a number of different speakers on who are in a similar mode where they are experimenting with tools. But I'll park that, Guy, and do some other questions. Guy says, I'm wondering how we reconcile the idea of spatial hypertext with the desire for local first, non-proprietary, and no-code, low-code file formats, as say outliner tools like Obsidian and Logseq do using Markdown conventions. Can you point to any authors or work on this question? Spatial hypertext, open formats, you'll tear Markdown from my dead cold hands. That's the trilemma.
Well, I think that Markdown can be factored out of this. Markdown is just another markup representation that actually maps very neatly onto HTML. That's its point. That's what Gruber and Schwartz were originally doing. And both map perfectly well into all, RTF or whatever you want to use for representing style text. So Markdown is, in this broad architectural term, a red herring. The difficulty is that we want really open tools, but and ideally no code. And we want a spatial representation that has to be rich, expressive, interactive. You have to be able to move things around. You have to be able to navigate, and also need scale. You need at least thousands of notes and thousands of entities with spline links and computed diagrams at 60 hertz, which, 16 milliseconds is not a whole lot of time to recalculate all those links. So as lots of people have found, this is challenging, and it's challenging to do as a hobby. which lots of people try, and they works with 10, but it doesn't work with 100, much less 1,000.
I feel like there's a couple things embedded in that as well, where I'm like, oh, Rust fixes this, right? Mark Antoine Parent says, curious about this thesis you quoted, finding issue with link types. I know Tinderbox uses link types. What do you think of them now?
I think that Tinderbox's embrace of link types was and continues to be kind of half-hearted. I think it's a really interesting idea. I think Craig's thesis is a really dandy thesis. You can get it from University Microfilms, and if you search a bit, it's available online. But the premature commitment and classification problems are real. Often when you know this wants to be connected, but you don't know exactly how, or worse, you know it wants to be connected and there is some trivial way that you can use as a rationale, like it's a reference, and you really want a different connection, but you don't know it yet. So link types actually are not an obvious win, but they need to be revisited. There's a paper by the Nanards on should link anchors be type 2, which at the time seemed to be kind of a stunt, but I think really is worth a look. We do an awful lot with link anchors these days. That is the places where the link starts and ends. Not just visited link colors and breadcrumbs and transition animations, but all sorts of things. So typed link anchors might be a good idea, if only to say, I want this kind of an effect for this kind of link.
Right. Mark Antoine says, can you, what is the thesis author's name?
Randall J. Trigg.
Amazing.
2 G's on Trigg.
FJK, by the way, hypertext resulted in the one and only Latin user interface I know of. Roberto Busa's Thomas Opera Hominimia cum hypertextibus, with a mouse pointer equals sagita, arrow in Latin.
Yeah, Father Busa was a Vatican expert on Aquinas who did some very interesting pioneering work in hypertext editions, and actually began the digital humanities. I only saw him once at a hypertext conference where he presented that Latinical document in a session with Robert Coover, who was presenting student work of contemporary fiction. That was a session that really quite broke people's heads.
The other phrase we sometimes use is face melting, which in itself is actually a callback to the Raiders of the Lost Ark opening the Ark and having people's face melted. I'm glad I got that in video as a reference that we can point to in the future. Peter Wasilko, did any of the hypertext researchers embrace literate programming or use hypertext tools in the development of the source code that went into their systems?
Yeah, the person who did this most visibly was Casper Osterby, mangling the pronunciation, at, I believe, Aarhus, possibly Aalborg. But and there was quite a bit of work, especially in Scandinavia, on literate programming, and it continues to percolate. Peter's own work is the one I know best currently, but there was actually quite a lot of interest at first in using hypertext in development environments. Of course, our modern IDEs are deeply hypertextual. We just don't think about it this way, and no one thinks at all about the structure and rhetoric. After you've done the command control click on an API thing, you get to an explanation, which is great, but there's very little thought on what you get to from that explanation. And fixing the misclick, you click on this API call because this is not the call you want, and giving it a easy path to suggest the call that you do want is really highly desirable.
I'm losing the name of the we've had a speaker talk about their integrated development environment that in fact covers documentation. We're seeing some of these things emerge, but like just now, speaking of where we are in time. So
Forrest, are you thinking of Tutor Gerba?
Yes, that's exactly the one that I was thinking of.
The Pharaoh system.
Yeah. And there's some things I know that someone re-implemented TiddlyWiki in Pharaoh, which slams these things together. And of course, TiddlyWiki itself is a Quine, and I think that certainly LogSec is as well with its closureship and query system, where we talk about no code, but in many cases, it's almost like making the code of the application that is your notes visible so that you can customize it for yourself. Probably another thing to focus on. Mark Anderson, does virtual reality offer anything to spatial hypertext or free thinking spaces like Tinderbox Map? So, i.e., does the extra dimension add anything new? Does it map our mind thinking any better than 2D?
Oh, it might. I don't want to preclude it. There were some really fine experiments in three-dimensional hypertext systems at Boeing, Steve Poltrak and company, circa 93. They found two results that are cautionary. One is that people don't actually navigate very well in 3 dimensions. We aren't actually three-dimensional reasoners. We live in a 2.5 dimension world, and the half is very limited. In fact, as Boeing knows perfectly well, it's really hard to get fighter pilots to stop thinking of working in a plane and to actually work in 3 dimensions. That said, there are lots of problems relating to occlusion that are a pain in the neck in 2 dimensions. Also, planar graphs are quite rare. And in 3 dimensions, you can avoid some of the problems with confusing intersections with coincidental collisions of links. So there's lots of stuff that I think we want to look at in 3 dimensions. Historically, as soon as people say virtual reality, people and especially the press's minds go blank, and people say, gee whiz, it's the future. And the discussion ends there. And that's not particularly useful.
I think of Brett Victor's Dynamic Land or Seeing Spaces, where the environment itself is moldable as being, I don't know, it's like the inverse. It's like, no, the physicality of the 3D driving computation. So,
and in another area that we don't often talk about, in the game world, there's some extremely interesting work in broadly spatial hypertexts and narrative spaces. Stacy Mason has a system called Loom, a prologue-based narrative backend for walking simulators and role-playing games. That's extremely interesting. And it's not, strictly speaking, virtual reality, but it obviously could be.
Yeah, mentioning in the chat, Werner Vinge's Rainbow's End. So for those of you who don't read a lot of fiction, I highly recommend, in fact, reading some fiction. The one that I can recommend is Charles Stross's Halting State, which is, he wrote before a bunch of things, but it involves a layer for police called Cop Space, because MySpace was still prevalent at the time. And there's some other really interesting things in there that certainly helped me think about how we might integrate these systems. So please, everyone drop their sci-fi recs as well, with Werner Vinge's Rainbow's End being definitely in there as well. Sid asked, has someone tried to develop or think about tool for thoughts from top down? That is, thinking how a tool should work that has, let's say, 100K nodes in it.
Ooh, well, let me get at that tangentially. How many nodes you have does have a profound influence on the sort of approach you can use to manage them. You can do things in spatial hypertext with thousands of notes, but millions of notes you can't see. And so the space either has to be segmented into lots of 1,000-note spaces or just becomes a blur. We're just limited in terms of cognitive capacity and visual field. And it used to be we could just blame the screen, but now we're approaching the point where if you're willing to spend enough money, you can pretty much fill your visual field and it's still not enough space. My advice to end users has always been that 1,000 notes, you're going to be comfortable with spatial hypertext. 1,000,000 notes, we have nothing to offer except the database, query-based interfaces, which are bad because, among other things, you can't see all your work and you can't review it all. And so you don't see the things that you aren't looking for or that are, for some reason, evading your search. But it's all we've got.
Yeah, I think there's so much there of how much do you need on screen, how much do you need in the search index. I mean, even Jerry's 528,665 thoughts is not a lot for modern information systems, but it is for interfaces or so on.
Yes, picking up on something from the chat, Mikulski's brain, the brain, has a nice mechanism for elision, for showing things in a neighborhood and hiding or partly hiding things that aren't in that neighborhood. We have a small tribute to that in Tinderbox and the hyperbolic view. Mark Stefik patented hyperbolic geometry and for computer displays back in the day, but that patent finally ran, and hooray. But what you don't show is often as important a design decision as how you show what you do show.
Gabo, what is the difference between a knowledge graph database and a hypertext system?
My personal view is that hypertext incorporates things like knowledge graphs and concept graphs and topic maps and all of these specializations of concepts like ontology. I'm with Nilsson here. There is an underlying ontology, and all the things that we build are representations of the real ontology that's down there, the real structure of the information that we are trying to partially and imperfectly express. But I can and have been accused of colonialism in trying to pick up all these other disciplines and subsume them under hypertext.
Yes, we have text, we have hyper, intertwingle them together, all can come into the very large tent that Bernstein is hosting. I love it. I think of knowledge graph, almost as like, yes, there is an interest in a set of everything from technologies to standards. They're tools for making hypertext. I'll plus one that. Alan Laidlaw, do you have resources to learn more about the 2.5D limits to our thinking?
Look for Poltrock, as in POLT rock, in the ACM Digital Library. He had a number of papers, and his scholarship was really good. It'll provide links to a lot of the literature that preceded that.
Also makes me think about the classic Brett Victor's The Humane Representation of Thought, which is one layer up, but basically interfaces control what we can think, which I think probably goes to some of that, like mobile interface, AR, size of screen, and so on. We should do a poll to see how many for our community of even, if people go multi-monitor. I'm actually always fascinated by people who have setups of horizontal monitors and things like that as well. It would be interesting to see what that looks like. Alan Laidlaw, thoughts on why Twine isn't more popular? Seems cloistered to a cultural niche, but the ideas are very powerful, like a narrative domain-specific language, DSL. The core ideas seem like they'd be very useful in enterprise internal wikis, for instance. Is there anything else like it?
Well, Storyspace, of course. In lots of ways, I think Twine can be viewed as tiny Storyspace, or rather modern Storyspace, a reimplementation of Storyspace that embraces a JavaScript world. As for enterprises, the original point of TiddlyWiki, which is the Twine runtime, was in fact enterprise wikis as well as personal wikis. My own take is that Twine is fantastically popular, though it is popular in a community. What has been a problem for Twine is that it's dedicated in a deep, visceral way to not monetizing itself. And then it realized that like at least a developer needs to buy groceries, and there really has been no rhetorically good way for them to react to that.
I'm going to mention two things here on this. I have a long history in open source, and I feel like a lot of, certainly the mass market doesn't really understand what open source means. And there's people who maybe understand it a little, but somehow painting the fact that the developer has a day job that's well paid in tech or something like that. And I think commercialization is the only option. And as I said before, if buying Tinderbox gets you to do more Bernstein things, great. But you poured it into the system that exists today. And should we think more about models where people get paid to work on things that are open systems? Maybe even just a reaction from you, Mark, on what you see or how you think about open source in this context, which is not the same thing as non-commercialization, because one can sell, right?
Right. Diane Greco, now Diane Greco-Josephowitz, worked for me back in the day and wrote an important early paper on hypertext feminism called Hypertext with Consequences. Had a sign above her desk: indirect economies suck. One of the things we want to be aware of is creating a world again where all of the arts, and I class software design and implementation as among the arts, all of the arts are the prerogative of the prince and the priest, that they're financed exclusively by nobles who don't need finance, or government grants, or institutional support. We have come dangerously close to turning mainstream literature, and this and several other countries, into exactly that state. And there is a tendency to turn the software world into one in which the privilege of writing software is reserved for those people who have tenure, which is dangerously close to those people who are noble born. It is also not, I'm not going to get myself into too much trouble, but my comments on Stallman, who is, of course, done very important work and very useful work on free and open software. Eric Raymond is another person in this category, and we could go on. There is something unsavory about this combination that just is not good for people.
I also, this is another topic that we could go deep on that we'll pass on. By the way, this country, I'm in Canada, so I assume you mean the United States.
Yes, I do mean the United States.
Not to say that it is certainly particularly better in Canada. We have different variances here. I'm very interested in things in Europe, such as the Next Generation Internet project. In that grant and state funded bucket, but still very interesting.
Well, and I went to graduate school on NSF scholarship. Thank you, taxpayers. And NSF has been a wonderful force for humanity, as has the NIH. I'm currently taking Paxlovid. Thank you, NIH.
Yes.
But it's not perhaps an ideal model. One thing that's not obvious in this history is many of these systems were written the expectation that they could result in untold wealth. Because in the 80s and part of the 90s, you could actually make serious money, and people did make serious money selling software. That world has sort of collapsed, and increasingly, well, I have this semi-marketing idea of artisanal software, which is partly opposed, but of course, lots of the software we all use every day is written by tiny little companies and mostly implemented by 1 or 2 or 3 people. There may be actual reasons that this is a good way to set up software companies, but this isn't the way it used to be.
I wanted to actually touch base on, just briefly for the record, the enterprise internal wiki at Fission. It's something that I have attempted to build a culture of with some very basic discourse forum tools. To me, in a different context, the phrase enterprise internal wiki mostly fills me with dread. Sometimes because of the software, but many more times because of the processes around it. So I think that's another mode in thinking about, I think about Ronald Coase and information theory, and we're in this splintered world of many smaller pieces where the enterprise doesn't have the best knowledge on the inside either. There's some interesting stuff coming up. Kagi is a longtime licensed seller of artisanal software, who are now building a browser and a search engine. And you subscribe to the search engine and can customize it. And as an enterprise, you can even buy a team search. So to me, the enterprise internal wiki is like, well, no, that's actually not how it should work. You should have a curated selection of all of the world's knowledge as it relates to your enterprise, but that's not the current mode of how we think about these things. And in fact, most people in a company have to be trained to, or forced to, take notes and intertwingle them in some ways.
Yes. Speaking of fiction, John Brunner's Stand on Zanzibar is the first book which had a professional link maker, a guy whose job in the enterprise, very much inside the enterprise, was to link things together.
I did that accidentally in the very first big corporate environment that I worked on. I worked in. So yeah, I think we've gone an hour and a half. People are dropping off, and I think still enjoying it. I'll invite people to continue with the tag Tools for Thought Rocks on Mastodon or Twitter. At Eastgate is Mark on Twitter for his software company. Michael Becker had one more question, who said indirect economies suck? What was the name?
Greco.
Diane Greco.
Diane Greco, later Diane Greco Josephowitz.
Amazing. We will capture all of these things. I'm going to make sure that I copy down this Q&A. So we'll actually, I'm going to stop recording now. Mark, thank you so much for preparing this. Thanks for coming.
Thank you. Terrific questions. It's been years since I've done a talk that got such good questions.
Amazing. How else can we support you? Do you have anything else to point towards or share? What does Mark want?
Take a look at Tinderbox. Take a look at the papers. I write them for a reason. I write them for you.
Amazing. We will stop recording now. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.